We're talking today with Carl Wright of Fruitport, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Carl, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born May 22nd, 1924, Muskegon, Michigan. At that time, a lot of women didn't go to hospitals. I was born in my Aunt Nora's house at 409 Forest Avenue, Muskegon. My mother's doctor was a woman doctor. Her name was Powers, Dr. Powers, and she was supposedly the best around. And I ended up what they called an instrument baby. It was a difficult birth. For a while, they weren't sure that my mother or I, either one, would survive. We both did. My first night in this world was spent in my grandmother's arms, in my aunt's kitchen, in front of a gas stove with the oven open, keeping me warm. So that was my start.
Okay. Now, did they tell you how much you weighed when you were born?
I have a baby book in there that I could get you, and I think it's got all that information.
Okay, that's all right. Just like, were you like 1 pound or 5 pounds or?
I think I was probably six
Okay.
and a half.
All right. Okay. Now, then, what was your family doing for a living when you were growing up?
My father was employed at the Brunswick in Muskegon, which was a company that made bowling alleys and billiard tables and so on. In fact, he worked there basically his whole life.
Okay. During the Depression, did he have regular hours or regular pay?
During the Depression, almost everybody had periods of work and periods where there was no work. And I can remember a lot of prices, hamburger, 3 pounds for a quarter, 7 or 8 cents for a box of cereal, and then people didn't have it.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember the guys that used to smoke, couldn't afford cigarettes. They bought little cloth sacks of tobacco called Bull Durham or Buffalo and rolled their own. Money was scarce.
Okay. All right. Now, did your mother work outside of the home or?
No,
Okay.
not while I was growing up.
Right.
Later on, at the beginning of World War II, she went to work at the Brunswick also.
Okay. Now, during World War II, did Brunswick shift to war production, or were they still making bowling equipment?
I don't know how much bowling equipment they were making, but when I turned 18, I went to work at the Brunswick for about 3 days. They were making gliders for the military. And I wanted to work in the gliders.
Okay. All right.
And a guy named Nelson said there was no openings in there, and he put me making pontoons. And they were making wooden boats that could be laced together and planks put over them and span the river and run equipment over. So I worked at that for about 3 days, and I found out they hired some new help and put them on gliders. I went in, asked about it. Mr. Nelson said, "Your boss says you're doing so well where you're at, he wants to keep you." So I walked out.
Okay.
I went to work at a Leahy foundry for a couple of months. I was making cores for engines at the foundry, which was a very good job and paid very well. But the patterns that they used making cores interested me. And they had a pattern shop, and I wanted to work at the pattern shop, which was less money, but that was interesting. And they wanted to keep me on cores. So I shopped around, and Frank Schuler had Muskegon patterned and took me on as an apprentice. And I stayed there until my friends were drafted, and my three best buddies were leaving together, and they were 1 to 2 years older than I. And so Frank told me one day, he says, "Carl, I can keep 3 apprentices on deferments. You're one." So I walked out of there and went down and volunteered.
Okay. Now, let's back up a little bit in your story. Did you finish high school?
No.
How long did you go to school?
I would have graduated shortly after I went into service.
Okay.
So when I got out of service, I went back to junior college and run back to high school to pick up 1 credit. So my graduation was in the spring of 1946.
Okay. So you got almost all the way through high school before the war. Okay. Now, before Pearl Harbor happened, did you pay any attention to the news and what was happening in the world?
Not a lot. I was just a 17, 18-year-old kid then.
You had other things to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Between school, and I had a part-time job at Food City. And I had a car that I had to keep running.
Okay. Now, how did you learn about Pearl Harbor?
I think I heard about it over the radio. The morning it happened at home. We didn't have radios in cars back then to speak of. So I heard it at home that morning.
Okay. And what did you think at the time? Did you understand what that meant?
No, I did not. I knew it didn't sound good. And then after Roosevelt gave his speech and stuff, it really sounded serious.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, did you just assume at that point that you were going to go in the military?
Had no idea.
Okay.
I knew nothing about the military, except they were drafting guys and training.
Okay. Now, do you know, remember about when it was that you enlisted?
It was in December
of 42?
Of 42.
Okay, so a year after Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, once you go and you sign the papers, now what happens?
Well, they slipped me right in the next week. So I entered my induction dates 1942, December.
Mm-hmm.
My friends that I wanted to go with didn't go till sometime in January.
Okay. And then you signed up, and then what do they do with you? So you start up, and where do you go first?
I got on a train in Muskegon, went down to Custer.
Okay, so that's Battle Creek.
Battle Creek. And I mentioned this before, that my first Sunday in service, they come and they took a certain amount of guys out of the barracks, sent them over to the kitchen for KP. Didn't get to me. come to the next bunch of guys, they did get to me, and I ended up in the officers' mess, which was I enjoyed it. It wasn't a lot of work. They had ducks that day, and they gave each one of us guys like a half a duck. It was delicious. Yep. And other than that, my few days at Custer was being issued clothes, so on and so forth, taking tests, aptitude tests and so on. And then they called me in. I sat down with an interviewer, and he's looking the papers over. And he says, well, your eyes aren't good enough to be air crew or pilot. Other than that, what would you like to do? If I'd have known a lot more at that time, I might have chose something else, but I had played with radios a little bit. So I said, radio repairman. Okay. They sent me to Signal Corps down at Camp Crowder in Missouri.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, when you were at Fort Custer and you were did you request assignment to the Army Air Forces or Air Corps? Because how did they know to tell you that you couldn't be flight crew? Did you ask them about that?
I think maybe everybody wanted to get into the Army Air Force at that time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So when I sat down, he clued me in right away that I could not be flying personnel.
Okay. So they're sending you to Camp Crowder, Missouri. What part of the state is that in?
The two closest towns down there are Joplin and Neosho. Mm-hmm. And I was there 4 weeks in basic training.
Okay. Now, what did that basic training consist of?
Strictly military basic training, calisthenics, running, marching, guard duty, KP. Okay.
And how much emphasis was there on discipline and following orders?
That's military. Mm-hmm. That comes with military back then.
Okay. Now, how easy or hard was it for you to adjust to being in the military? I mean, did you just follow the orders right away?
We were so busy we didn't have time.
Okay. All right.
It was basic training kept you busy daylight to dark.
Okay. So you say you were there about 4 weeks. And what happened after that?
At the completion of that, I was sent to Kansas City to a civilian radio school. It was Midland Tech, I believe is the name. And they had made arrangements for quarters with hotels, boarding houses, so on. I was in a big house, 1601 Broadway in Kansas City. Our time was our own. We just had to attend our classes, get good grades. Other than that, we were on our own. They had kitchens set up and took care of our meals. We had an allowance, and the government allowance was sufficient to cover our board and our meals and a few dollars extra, mm-hmm. which they added on to our pay. I was made a corporal immediately on completion of basic. So I had corporal's pay and a little extra. That was a very good deal there in Kansas City.
And how long were you in Kansas City?
I believe it was roughly 3 months.
Okay. And then what did the actual training involve? What were you doing there?
We were studying basically radio theory, how radios worked, so on and so forth. It was a school teaching radio repair.
Okay.
You have to understand your different circuitries and so on.
Okay. Did you do any hands-on work? Did you work on
yes.
radios?
Our school days were broke into two parts, shop work and theory. So it covered everything.
Mm-hmm.
You were basically beginning radio repairmen when you walked out of school with your...
All right. Now, you said that your time was your own. So did you get to do things in Kansas City or?
After school, you took care of that. Yes, you could go to a show. One of the boys in the class, his home was in Kansas City. So he didn't live with the rest of the guys. He lived at home. And he and I were friends. I'd go out to his house, go out with his friends in the evening, go to a show or something like that. Yes.
Okay. Now, when you were in Missouri, when you were at Camp Crowder and then you're in Kansas City, Missouri was still a segregated state. Did you notice that at all?
Not a lot. Because basically we were with the military most of the time. We were not out into the civilians.
Right. Okay. All right. So now, once you complete your training in Kansas City, where do you go next?
I got a train, went to Tampa, Florida.
Okay.
And I arrived in Tampa. First couple of days, they had a bunch of tents set up at Oldsmar Racetrack in Coldwater. So we just spent a couple of days there while they were sorting out our papers, so on. And then they assigned us to companies or units and continued our training.
Okay.
And that's where I had all the training and so on in the communication setups and so on.
Now, were you training specifically for a particular part of the service, or could they have sent you anywhere?
The training I had basically was for information centers. And the West IC down there was an information center. And I was told that I would be an instructor. I had a good memory, and I was fairly intelligent. And so they were training me to stay there and be an instructor.
Okay.
I got a furlough. I came home and I told everybody, I said, I'm all set. I'll be in Tampa for the duration. I'm going to be an instructor at the West IC there in Tampa. And it didn't work that way. After my furlough, I went back and we started classes. And I mentioned this, Roosevelt wanted to change Thanksgiving that year to the third Thursday. Florida went along with that. So I was down there at the West IC, had Thanksgiving dinner. A couple of days later, there was an outfit that was scheduled to go overseas. A couple of radio men didn't pass their overseas physicals. And so Carleton, year one. So the next week I had a Thanksgiving dinner in New York at Camp Shanks. A couple of days later I was on the Queen Mary.
Okay. Now, how do they get you from Florida to Camp Shanks?
We used a lot of railroads back then.
And what were those train rides like?
Miserable. A lot of those trains were coal-fired, and little cinders would get in the air and you were itching all over. I mean, train rides were miserable.
Okay. So you had the windows open and they would...
Oh, yeah.
Stuff would come in, yeah.
Especially a couple of times they went through tunnels. All that. Yeah, train rides back then were nothing like train rides today.
Okay. Now, did they also make you stop a lot or wait for other trains, or did you get to go right through?
I don't recall.
Okay. All right. So now they've sent you up. So you've gone through really about a year of training, or close to a year, between these different places, because you made it now to Thanksgiving in '43. Okay. You get to Camp Shanks, New York. And did you get to go into New York City, or did you just go on a ship?
No. Getting ready to go overseas and that, we were right at the camp most of the time.
Okay. And then did you say you were on the Queen Mary, or?
Queen Mary.
Okay.
And the Queen Mary is a fast boat. We went without a convoy to slow us down. About 4 days we were landed in Scotland.
Okay. And now what do you remember about that sea voyage?
I remember the room I was in had a placard up there. That room was designed when they built the boat to accommodate 2 stewards. They fixed up kind of 8 bunks in that room and put 16 guys in there. We would have the room for 24 hours, and then we had to spend the next 24 hours wandering around the boat and on deck while the other 8 guys had the room. Mm-hmm. I can remember that much.
Okay.
I can also remember that I was not alone in thinking this, that the Queen Mary would stock up on supplies in New York, but they would feed us English food on the way over, and I don't know if our supplies hit the black market then or what, but it seemed like they had kidney stew every other day.
It's a good thing it was just 4 days.
Yes.
All right. Did you have any bad weather on the way over?
No.
Okay.
It was smooth sailing on the way over.
All right. And now where did they land you in Britain?
I think it was a Firth of Forth in Scotland.
Okay.
We just got off the boat, went on a train, and right to England. I knew nothing about Scotland, didn't see any of it.
Okay. And where did you go in England?
Our first stop was a tent city, and I have no idea what part of England it was. I know it was called the Queen's Oaks, and I know there was a castle sitting over there in the corner. And we lived in tents for a few weeks while they processed all our papers and assigned everybody. We weren't all Signal Corps in that camp. We were a mixture of everything, you know, and had to be assigned here, there, and all over. And I think I went to Reading Air Base, from there, and then down to Colchester. Mm-hmm. All right. A few days later.
Okay. And then when you got to Colchester, what did you do there?
I had some radios to take care of, and basically it was military life. I was on duty so many hours taking care of radios. The rest of the time I could sleep, do what I wanted to, get a pass to go into town, maybe go to a show. A couple of us guys would wander in. And Colchester had a little shop where they served fish and chips, some of the best fish and chips I ever had. And I recall one day that we went in there, and instead of fish and chips, they had a choice: sausage and chips or fish and chips. And those sausages looked so good. Not only me, but several guys ordered that sausage, and once you took a bite of it, it was mostly sawdust, oatmeal, or with maybe a little pork fat in it, you know. And we didn't eat it. We ate the chips. Mm-hmm. And I can remember a woman sitting there with her daughter. Her daughter was maybe 8, 9 years old. And the daughter asked her mother, "What's the matter with these Americans? They're not eating their sausages." And the woman said, "These Americans are only half hungry."
All right. Now, you went into Colchester. When you're in the town, how did the people there treat you?
Friendly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got along good there. I never was one to drink, but I would go in and I learned to shoot darts and drink some lemonade. Mm-hmm. Or shandies, they call them part of the time, that they'd mix a little beer with lemonade.
Okay. And would you go into London?
No.
Okay.
I did get one pass into London later, after, just shortly before the invasion.
Okay. And did you go into London then?
I did, and I don't remember very much about that trip.
Okay. Now, while you were at Colchester, were there ever any German air raids or other attacks?
The Blitz was on when I was in Colchester, and the Germans went over every night. And we'd watch them. They were not bothering us any. They were on their way to London. Mm-hmm. And that was before the V1s and the V2s came along. So I wasn't in Colchester when they were active.
Okay. So, but there were some German conventional aircraft that were still flying over.
Or Junkers or whatever. Mm-hmm. And German engines have a different sound than American engines. And of course, your anti-aircraft lighting, you know, you see these beams lacing the sky with beams of light trying to pick up.
Yeah. Did you have a sense of whether there were very many German aircraft or just smaller numbers than ours, or?
There's quite a few.
Okay.
And we didn't pay attention to that much, you know. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now you're there in early '44, and they're getting ready for the Normandy landings in June. How did your job change over time?
They picked up 3 radio men, and one was Mike LaSalle from Jersey, Christy S. Novikov, and we used to call him Joe, from Wapatu, Washington, and I, radio men. They put us on special assignment, and we went to work with some teleprinter men, and I don't recall their names especially, but they wanted us to develop radio connections between units. Now, this work had already been done with wire. Westinghouse made what we call the CF1 bay, which was actually 4 radios in a stack, different frequencies, that if you run one wire to another CF1 bay with the same frequencies, you could run 4 telephones with 1 wire.
Mm-hmm.
They also made CF2 bays, and they had 2 circuits in each for teleprinters. And if you took 2 of those bays and had 4 different frequencies, then you could feed those 4 frequencies into 1 wire and stick it into, say, the first circuit of a CF1 bay, and that let you have 3 telephones and 4 teleprinters working on 1 wire.
Mm-hmm.
And that had all been worked out ahead of time. But it's hard to run a wire across the channel. So they had us working to see if we could use radio signals instead of wire. There's a company in Ohio, Fred Link, I think it was Cincinnati, that built a little commercial FM radio. It operated very high frequency, between 70 and 100 megacycles. And we got some of these little radios. And we would set a radio up with the receiver on a lower frequency and the transmitter on a higher frequency, set up the second radio just the opposite, so that we could continuously send signals and receive signals. Where you had the radio on the same frequency, you know, it's intermittent. You either send or receive. We set those up with 1 frequency down at the low end and 1 frequency at the high end, put up 2 antennas at each station, 100 feet apart or so the signals did not interfere with each other. And we're sending FM signals, which are static free, and you don't get interference, to the other stations. So that turned out to work really well. We had to iron out a few bugs and change a few circuits here and there so that when a signal started coming in, it would activate the radios, and we got that. We had 2 stations set up, I don't know, 15 miles apart. Okay. General Eisenhower come over to check it out. And he talked on the different telephones, and he typed messages on the different printers, and he ran over to the other, to the other station 15 miles away and checked it all out and called back. And they were very happy. Well, I was done then. I went back to my outfit and running an NCS station, more or less. I had about 5 to 7 radios and radio operators, and each one of those radios went to different locations, and messages going back and forth. And of course that was all CW or Morse code, and at that time.
Okay. Now, were the messages you were sending, were they encoded, or were they just clear?
Everything. Okay. Everything we sent was in 5-letter groups. So when you received that, you had to have your decoder or your whatever, and had to be set up on a certain combination, and if you didn't get that right, it didn't work. Okay. And as you fed those 5-letter groups through these things, your message come out in plain text.
Okay. Now, when you were talking about this radio system you were setting up, was this the first time anyone had ever done that?
As far as I know, there had been no need of this before. Mm-hmm. And after the invasion and after we established part of France, there was no need for it again.
Okay.
It was just a one-shot deal. You wanted communications for the invasion.
Right.
As fast as they had secured an area, they set a station up over there, they had communications.
Okay. Because eventually they will run cables across the channel and that kind of thing too. But right there at the very start, they need you to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so where were you when the invasion actually happened?
I think I was at Middle Wallop Air Base. And I stayed there until a couple of weeks, a week and a half after the invasion. And they sent us over, and I did the same thing over there, set up stations.
Okay. How did they get you across the channel?
Well, I went on a boat, and I think it was an LST. Run up close to the beach, opened up, and they had a bulldozer. Push the beach right out there. So we didn't get wet or nothing. We just, and I drove a truck with radio equipment on it. Just drove it off the boat.
Right.
Up the beach.
Okay. Now, did you land on Omaha Beach, or were you on Utah? Or...
You know, I think it was Omaha.
Well, if there were kind of big sand dunes you went up in between,
oh, yeah.
That's Omaha.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a bunch of pillboxes all along the top there.
Okay. Now, at the time you landed there, was there still wreckage around or beach obstacles?
Yeah, there was a lot of wreckage. And of course, all those pillboxes, we'd go up there and we'd look in there, you know, and so on. And there's a bunch of gunpowder laying around. Germans used little sticks. Some of it was round, some of it was a little flat, looked like maybe 3-4 inches long, inch wide, 1/16 of an inch thick, different colors. And the guys found out, you know, that's all gunpowder. And of course, a lot of guys smoked around there. That didn't make any difference. But you grab those and touch a match to them and hold them like sparklers.
Do you know what the Germans used that for?
Yes, that's what they loaded the 88s with. And that's what they had in those pillboxes was their 88 millimeter cannons. And then, of course, the projectile you put in and the distance you wanted determined what kind of powder and how much.
Okay, so that works like other large artillery pieces. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Now, how close to the beach did you set up camp? Did you go inland a ways, or were you there?
Well, I think we went to the top of the hill that first night. And we stayed there a couple of days, and then we started fanning out.
Now, do you know, and were you going and setting up radio stations, or were you fixing radios, or?
Setting them up.
Okay.
You know, most of our equipment was new at that time. Didn't need repairmen. They need installers.
Now, and do you know if these were specifically radio stations that would work with the Air Forces, or were they for everybody?
Most of the work I did was tied into the Army Air Force.
Okay, and would this have been the 9th Air Force then? Because the 9th Air Force gave support for the ground units.
Yeah. Well, it was 9th Air Support Command that I went to when I left Colchester.
Okay, so that will be 9th Air Force. All right. Now, how long did you then, so you were then in Normandy for the whole time of that campaign?
No.
Or did they move?
I was out of Normandy, and we wandered down. I set up some stations down near the Brest Peninsula.
Okay. But that's after the breakout from Normandy then?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And then I wandered around across France behind the infantry and the artillery and stuff, set up stations a couple of places. I ended up in Verdun, and I got a chance to look at some of the memorials there from World War I seen that trench where the French were getting ready to charge, had their bayonets on and everything, and the artillery hit and caved that in, and it was still there back then. You could see the bayonets sticking out of the ground, and different counties in France had memorials for their county, and a lot of their soldiers were there, and a lot of those, we look in the rooms and it was just a bunch of bones and stuff that were in there. But it was memorials to the World War I.
Okay. Now to go back again, go back to when you were in Normandy. One of the things that happened there was that we launched some very large bombing raids against the Germans around St. Lo, where pretty much the whole 8th Air Force came out. Do you remember that? Lots of bombers all at once? Or?
I've watched bombers going over 1,000 plane raids, and that sky would just look like lacework with contrails. Yeah.
Okay. But you were some distance away, though, from whatever they were doing.
I wasn't anywhere close to where the bombs were being dropped.
Okay. Now, as you were moving around in different places in France, how close would you get to the front lines?
I have no idea. I was close enough. At times I could hear some artillery, but I don't think I was close enough to get shot at.
Okay. All right. Now, how much did you see of the French people? Did you see civilians around?
A few.
Did
but, you know, I didn't speak French, and so.
So you really didn't have a whole lot of contact with them at that time? Okay. Now, we're getting later in the year, so you get into the fall, and you're in northeastern France, you're at Verdun for a while, and then where do you go from there?
Well, while my outfit was at Verdun, I run some repeater stations. I run one up into Belgium, and I run one after that. I got back to Verdun, then I went into Luxembourg. And radio contact from way back here to the front lines was kind of iffy at times. So we set a station up in between, call it a repeater station, so we'd have good communications. And I run that one repeater in Luxembourg for 2 or 3 weeks, and it became obsolete, didn't need it anymore. So I went back to Verdun. From Verdun, they just transferred me right back to 9th Air Force headquarters in Le Bourget. And I was there then for 7 months. But shortly, a few days after I left Luxembourg, the Battle of the Bulge come by. And they would have wiped my repeater station out if it had been there.
Okay. Now, does a repeater station become obsolete because they put in wires and landlines, or?
That, and they're moving the other stations closer.
Okay. All right, so they, temporary thing. Now, you had a letter that you sent home that you showed us, that you wrote after the war. You mentioned being in a town called Saint-Hubert, or St. Hubert. Do you remember, was that after Le Bourget or before it?
That was before I went to Le Bourget.
Okay.
I run a repeater station there.
Okay. Because I think that one was in Belgium, probably.
No, that Saint Hubert was in Luxembourg.
That's in Luxembourg. Okay. Now, also, you mentioned one station where you were talking about being in small villages, and there was a fellow with goats.
Yeah,
or whatever. What was that story? Can you?
That was, I think, in Luxembourg.
Okay.
And after the war, I went through different German villages set up that way, where the farmers would put their houses all in a row for protection, you know. If you had a farmhouse way out in the open, why, the raiders would come by and so on. So for protection, they would put houses together and then go from their houses out to their fields. And I've seen several villages set up like that.
Okay.
Which was a necessity at the time.
Or in some earlier century, anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess the story about the man and the goats, you told us that when we were not on camera. So you say you were in a place in Belgium, and there was an old man who lived there in this village. And what was he doing?
He'd start at the end of the village in the morning, and he'd walk down the street. Every one of those houses, and the animals are smart. They knew it was time to go to the pasture. They would come out of the barns and follow him. He had a little dog, keep them in line, out the end of the village and up to where I had a repeater station. There had been a little airport up there. Just a sod field, you know, and he was pasturing the village animals up there. People had goats for milk and cheese and so on. And the only English this old man knew, he'd come over and stay with us, and we'd give him some lunch too. And the only English he knew was that name of that song, popular back then, Shoo Shoo Baby. So every time he'd look at you, he'd say, Shoo Shoo Baby.
Okay. All right. Now, so but after that then, so in the latter part of the war, you're back at Le Bourget, which is outside of Paris. And did you get to go into Paris very often or travel around?
That 7 months I was in Paris, I had duty hours. Mm-hmm. We had, my information center was set up in the terminal building there at Paris. All my radio stations were there. When I wasn't on duty, my time was my own. We had an apartment across the street, and all our radio men were in that apartment building. We could catch a bus right outside of the apartment building and go a couple of miles, and I've got a book on Paris laying around here someplace I can show you. Showed the whole metro system. Mm-hmm. And we catch a metro, and of course we could ride those free. Mm-hmm. So I wander around Paris. I go downtown, Champs-Élysées. Arc de Triomphe was right there, a couple of good restaurants along in there. And Concorde was at the other end. Go over to Eiffel Tower or Palace at Versailles. Mm-hmm. What? Our time was our own, more or less. Okay. I quite often used to go into the theater down there where Glenn Miller's band would rehearse and record for the American station, the AEF, and so on. And I met a few of the band members, and I'd go in and listen to them play once in a while, or USO shows would come to Paris. our time was basically our own for that 7 months.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then how did the people in Paris treat the Americans?
I would say fairly well. They were glad to see the Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And I happened to be on duty when the Germans surrendered. And I was told that that town just went wild that day. It was wild the next day yet when I got down there. But
okay. Now, you weren't a drinker, so I guess you probably stayed out of trouble.
yeah,
Now, were there some men in your units who would get in trouble? Drink too much or things
yeah,
like that?
some of them, but mostly not.
Okay.
My group were all non-coms or officers, and they drank a little. I know one of my best radio operators, Alfred Tarver, really got drunk one time. Then he sobered up and was all right. But I felt sorry for Alfred. He had a big farm down south, a couple of kids. His wife went to the draft board and said, I can get along without him. I can take care of the farm. You can draft him. So he was getting a divorce. But then he had a girlfriend down south too, and they were going to get married when he got out of service. He got a Dear John letter and tipped him over the edge. He really got drunk.
Okay. Now, did any of the men have French girlfriends or?
Some did.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if my wife's listening or not, but I run across a girl, her name was Alice Reinhardt, or Alice. She worked at the Bourse. And she quit that job and got a job at the airport, working for Air France. And she spoke English really well. Mm-hmm. And we became friends. And that was all, just friends. And my wife was jealous of her because that's all we were. Mm-hmm. No romantic interludes or nothing. But we liked each other. And she would write my mother all the time. And even after we were married,
okay,
my mother and her would still correspond a little bit.
All right. Now, you said you got to the point here where the war had ended, or the Germans have surrendered. And after the Germans surrender, do you stay in Paris or do you move somewhere else?
9th Air Force headquarters moved to Bad Kissingen, Germany, which is near Schweinfurt. And we had a hospital there, and of course headquarters, we had our net control. And headquarters stayed there as long as I was in Europe. Mm-hmm. And we sent a few of our people into Berlin. And I went into Berlin, set radios up there. But while I was in Bad Kissingen, and I mentioned this before, one of our pilots one day called me and he says, hey, I got to make a run. You want to ride along? Well, there's one airplane in the Air Force that wasn't an American airplane. The only one, foreign airplane we used, was a Nordun Norseman. It was called a UC-64, which is a short field airplane, 600 horse, 54-foot wingspan, and can get in and out of small, unimproved fields. We went, and I have no idea where. They give us directions, grid coordinates and stuff. We went in, there was a wheat field alongside of one of the German prison camps that they had mowed a strip of wheat. I mean, that wheat was that high on both sides. We landed in that strip. There were some people standing alongside out there. I opened the doors, 6, 7 people or so climbed in, never said a word to them. They were in ragged clothes and maybe not too clean. Shut the door, we took off. We got back to Bad Kissingen, and there were several majors, colonels, general or two, and some congressmen, I believe, met our airplane, and I have no idea who those people were, whether they were politicians or scientists or outside of being important people.
Okay. Now, did they look really thin or sickly or just in bad clothes?
Hard to tell. I don't know what they looked like, if they'd been fed good and in good conditions. I know that there's a lot of people around there in Germany who didn't look any better than they did.
Now, how long was this after the end of the war? Was this like within a few weeks, or was it longer?
Yeah, it was only a few weeks after we went to Bad Kissingen.
Yeah, but how long, when did you go to Bad Kissingen then? Was that right after the surrender, or?
No, it was before.
Oh, okay. So you were already going into Germany even?
Yeah, we had headquarters in Bad Kissingen. And, of course, if you followed the news, I don't know what kind of a deal our politicians made with the Russians, but the Germans were begging us to cross the Elbe River and take over. And we stopped at the Elbe River and let Russians rape Germany.
Yeah. Now, as far as you know, did you go into the Russian zone to pick those people up, or were they just within the Western zone, probably?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I know when I first went to Berlin, it was before Berlin was divided into sectors. We went into Gatow Air Base for the first few weeks. And that was a training base. And of course, us guys, you know, like airplanes. And between mechanics and some other friends I made, we had 17 little German airplanes flying at one time. And I had one picture that I brought home of the little Bucher Youngman that I had. And that's the airplane I learned to fly in.
Okay. So you learned to fly while you were there in Germany?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, what did Berlin itself look like at that time?
Well, if you went down the streets, you picked your way around through piles of rubble. If you flew over the top of it, you'd swear there was nothing there. Tops of the buildings had all been demolished, most of it. I remember at the Brandenburg Gate at the end of Unterden Linden there was still intact. I've been through that gate a few times and up and down the main street. And of course this was after a couple of weeks because Berlin had been divided at that time into sectors, and we had taken over Tempelhof. So I moved from Gotto to Tempelhof.
And then, did you see anything of the Russians?
Oh, yes.
What impression did you have of them?
I wasn't impressed. I do know that the Russians talked to some of us guys and asked us how we like Russian equipment. And we said, what do you mean Russian equipment? Well, look, these trucks and stuff that we got, look at how good they are. And we said, yeah, but look at all the placards and stuff in the truck. They're all in English, little brass plates. And then Russian directions are written in and penciled in more or less, you know. And they, well, we make them that way so that we can furnish trucks to you guys and you can understand. I don't know if you, I see you laughing. It looks to me like you've heard that story before.
I haven't heard that story, but I knew that we sent enormous numbers of trucks to the Russians. Ours were better made than theirs, and ours didn't break down as fast.
Right.
But I hadn't heard the part where they told their soldiers that they made them in Russia.
They told their soldiers a lot of things. Now, in Berlin, I can remember I met Bob Hope. I happened to be on duty, operations duty that day when Bob come in, and I talked with him, and Bob is curious. He was asking all kinds of questions, and he wanted to know what was going on. And I watched his show that night, and I can remember then why he was asking questions. Now, there was a big black market in Berlin. Russian soldiers hadn't been paid in years. The war's over. We had invasion money, and American money, English money, Russian money, all was identical except for the serial numbers on them. One country, all the serial numbers began with a 0. Another country, all the serial numbers began with a dash. And that's about all I remember of that. But they were paid in a lump sum, and they had to spend that money because Russian didn't back it. They'd only back a percentage. So I can remember Bob Hope talking to us guys. He come out on the stage and, you know, he started talking, and he looked at his watch and kept talking. A few minutes later, he glanced at his watch again. A few minutes later, in the monologue, he looked at his arm, no watch. He reached down in his pocket and he pulled out a lot of bills. Watches were selling for $700, $800, $1,000 a piece if they run. Those Russians would buy anything because that money was actually worthless to them. But I can remember Bob Hope doing that.
All right. How long did you spend in Berlin?
I really don't recall how many months I spent there.
Okay, but several months.
Yeah.
Okay. Now,
And while I was there then, I went through another set of physicals and so on, CBI we called them. And I was getting ready to be shipped to the Asian theater when Harry decided to drop the bomb. So I didn't get to go to the Asian theater.
okay. Now, did you go back to Bad Kissingen, or did you stay in Berlin?
I stayed in Berlin. I had enough points after the war then. So I stayed in Berlin. And after the war was over, then 301st and Airborne and that, we put on air shows. And one of the pilots that I'd been flying with, and one of the guys that taught me to fly, was a glider pilot. And I got to ride in the air shows with him in a cargo glider. Except the last show. And the last show he wanted to go alone. And he really showed off. He let the other 4 gliders come in and land, and they're all in a line. And then he cut loose and looped that great big box with wings on it, capable of carrying a Jeep and a crew of 2, or 13 men and equipment. And he, no power, looped that thing and landed and pulled it right up in line.
All right. Now, when you get your orders to go home, what was the process for getting you back to the States?
Any way we could get there. They sent us, a bunch of us, to a center at Stuttgart. And then from there we had airplanes flying across, but they quit flying twin engines. They were only going to fly 4 engines. Mm-hmm. So that made that list that much longer. And at Le Havre in France, they had what they called cigarette camps. And before I found this out, I have to tell you a little bit about Bill. While I'm waiting to find a ride home, any way I can get there, I didn't care. I came home on a victory ship, SS Madawaska. Spent a week and a half in the Atlantic in December. It was miserable. But anyway, one afternoon I went to the theater and I'm sitting there, and young guy my age, I was young too, mentioned Muskegon. So I had to ask him, "You're from Muskegon?" He said, "No, I'm from the Heights." And I get talking with him, and I started school at South Park in the Heights. I went there 4 years. I went through 3rd grade, and my folks moved to Muskegon. Mm-hmm. Then I went through the Muskegon system. His folks moved into the Heights, and he started in South Park in the 3rd grade, right in the seat I left. We knew all the same kids and so on. We never run across each other before that. And he was engaged to Lois Mixer, who was one of my little girlfriends back in 1st grade. Her dad was a dentist in the Heights. So we became friends. So we stayed together. We had a chance. I heard there was a boat in Le Havre at Camp Philip Morris that we had a chance to get on. We rode a 40 and 8 from
boxcar?
Stuttgart to La Havre.
Okay.
I don't know how you'd ever get 40 men on one of them. I don't think we had 20 on a car, and it was crowded.
Okay. This is a boxcar, right?
Right,
Just a
box
regular,
car.
not a passenger train car, but just a
No
regular
way
car.
a passenger train. 8 horses. That's why they call them 40 and 8. They'll transport 8 horses or 40 men. So Bill and I come home together. After we were discharged from Atterbury a week or so later, I come into the Heights. We had no telephones out here. And I called Bill's folks, and Bill was home. So I'm talking with Bill, and he says, "Where are you calling from?" And I said, "Well, I'm at Weeks Drugstore, which is on the corner of Sherman and Peck Street in the Heights." I said Broadway before, but I mean, they're a block apart. And Bill said, "Oh," he says, "you see that girl behind the counter?" I said, "Yeah." "She goes by the name of Cy. It's my sister." So when I got through talking to Bill, I turned around and I said, "Hi, Cy." And she gave me a funny look. "Well, who are you?" You know. So I went over and talked to her a while. We become friends. We never seriously dated or that, but we knew each other. And so Bill and I each got married. We didn't run around together a lot. We kept in contact. Don Hunter was a mutual friend. Come walking into the shop at Anaconda where I worked, and he says, "Carl, I got bad news." He says, "Bill was sick yesterday. He went to the doctor." That was 1955. There was a polio breakout around here. Mm-hmm. My next door neighbor here lost one of their daughters. I lost a cousin in that polio breakup. Mm-hmm. And the doctor told Bill, "You got a late case of polio. Don't go home. Expose your kids." So Bill went to his folks' house. He took a turn for the worse that night and died the next morning.
Wow.
That's how serious polio can be. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, he'd broke up with Lois Mixer. He married Pat Clover. I'd gone to school with Pat Clover and through Nelson School and through high school. So anyway.
Right. So when did you get married?
1948.
Okay.
Which, by the way, in 2 days, it'll be 69 years, mm-hmm. September 2nd.
All right.
So later on, I'm sitting in the office in Fremont, and a young man walks in, and he says, "I'm interested in learning to fly. What's involved?" So I told him what was necessary, what he would have to do, what the courses were like, and so on. And after I got all through, I said, he said, "Well, I'm interested." I said, "Yeah." I said, "What's your name?" He says, "Bill Seifert." And I said, "Well, Bill, if you got a couple of minutes, I got a story for you." So I told him about meeting his dad, mm-hmm. so on. And I said, "How's your mother?" "Your mother's name Pat?" "Yeah." I said, "But she had died a year or two earlier with cancer." A few weeks later, he come in for a lesson, and he says, "My Aunt Cy in Florida called me the other day, and I told her I was taking flying lessons from you." And she says, "Yeah, I know him." Mm-hmm. Small world.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned before that after you came back from the service, you finished high school, you did some community college.
I was discharged in December of 1945. I got home for Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to junior college for a semester. Then I went to Anaconda in June, I believe, and I had gone back to high school, picked up that credit, so I graduated in 46.
Mm-hmm.
That fall, work was really good. I was working a lot of overtime. I thought I'd better work and save some money. So I didn't get back to junior college. Then I met Berta, got married and started raising a family. I never did get back to school.
Okay. So what kind of career did you go into?
Well, I worked at Anaconda, and I was happy. I had a decent job, decent wages, family. And then in the 60s, in the mid-60s, Anaconda went on strike. So my job was gone while they're on strike. I run the credit union, so I run the credit union for a while. And I had been flying all this time. So I wandered out the airport and I started flying a couple of students. Anaconda was on strike for 11 months. When they went back to work, I had a couple of airplanes, rented a hangar, had a school established. So I went back and I tried to run both for a while. I decided that that's too much. I had the farm going too.
Mm-hmm.
I had to cut back someplace. So I left Anaconda.
Mm-hmm. All right.
But I still have friends. Every Tuesday morning I have coffee with some of the old Anaconda employees yet.
All right. Okay. Now, when you look back at the time that you spent, I guess, in the service, how do you think that affected you, or what did you learn from that?
That's hard to say. I've learned a little bit of something different, I think, every month I've lived.
Mm-hmm.
And it all affects the total.
Okay. All right. And when you think back to the time when you were in the service, are there other particular memories that stand out for you that you haven't talked about yet?
Not really.
Have we missed anything?
Well, you have a lot of the post-service. That's all
Yeah.
already intact.
Yeah, we got that, yeah.
I'm trying to think, anything that was missing from the. Yes, and if you'd answer to him, not to me, what was the significance of your wireless communication across the channel? What did that mean?
The wireless communication that we had just meant that both sides knew what was going on at the other side through static-free FM teleprinter communication as well as telephones.
Mm-hmm. And you were doing communication largely for the air forces, and the air bases were still in England at that time.
Yes.
So you talked to them to call in the support or whatever else, and that would have been a lot of it. And when they move over to your side of the channel, then that changes. But
Yeah, all the units over there then that are tied into telephones and teleprinters, they are sending messages back. Now, one of the messages that did come back was up on the, near Levest, I think it was, in France. The Germans were using a church steeple spotting for their artillery. And we got the message, and they give us the grid coordinates. We turned around and sent the message back from Information Center to, I think we called it the Ancon. That was the flagship that run up and down the channel, and I think it was the Missouri. The next pass the Missouri made, and this is in the newspapers and everything back then, they cut a broadside out and cut that steeple off.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Now,
one of the fellows I worked with at Anaconda, Al Flickema, was landed on D-Day, and he was later, and I was telling this story at Anaconda one day with a couple of the guys, and he said, "I seen that church." He was back there, and he seen the church. He didn't see it happen, but he did see the church with the steeple missing.
Okay. Now, did you normally know what the contents of your messages were?
No.
Yeah. Yeah, you're just relaying things, and it's in code.
Yeah.
Okay.
Would it be too much to say that you were part of the reason that the Normandy invasion succeeded? Tell me about that. Tell him about that.
I don't know. Was your question on tape?
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. I can say this. We can start at Detroit. We can start any place in the United States. Anybody on a job working defense was a part of the organization that led to victory. We all had a job to do. Without our jobs being successful, we'd have never won the war. I look back and say, hey, some of these guys run up and threw grenades into machine gun nests, killed a bunch of Germans, took a bunch of German prisoners and so on, come home with all kinds of medals and that. All I did was set up radios. But at the same time, the job I did was necessary for the outcome that we succeeded at.
Well, it certainly was, and it was also not a common job. Not that many men did what you did.
There is one more thing that Carl talked about last time. Carl, you talked about how your war was so different from many other men, that they started with a group and ended with a group, but that was not your history. Could you tell Jim about that? James, excuse me. Which do you like
No,
better?
I moved around so much into many different areas that I knew a lot of people shortly. I never bonded like some of the people that spent years together. They were like brothers, band brothers. They worked together. They're family. I never was in a group like that. I had a personal friend here and a personal friend there for a while, and then maybe I'd move on or they'd move on. But I never had that comradeship that, say, a flight crew has. A B-17, there's 10 men. They depend on each other totally. I was always more or less alone. So I don't know if I missed that or not. I never experienced it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's a reminder of why we talk to people. Everybody's experience is a little bit different, and they all add up to that bigger picture that you were talking about. All right. So I'd just like to close here by thanking you for taking the time to share your story today.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
I hope it's interesting enough
Yes,
that
sir.
people would
Oh, yeah.
enjoy it.
Shall I stop?